This sermon is entitled, if I can remember it, Right and Illusion or a Defense, Corporate Personhood Separates the Declaration of Independence from the Constitution. That thought occurred to me when I read this. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States are the most two important and enduring documents of our nation's history. It has been said the Declaration of Independence was the promise, and the Constitution was its fulfillment. Has that promise been broken? Is the question we're going to look at today. To begin with, I thought I would ask and to think about and ponder what the principles mean to you, our 7 principles. I have talked to a couple people that were at the meeting and when they worked to get the principles, when the Universalists and the Unitarians became one organization, and I've heard 2 different stories. One person said this was the least common denominator we could agree on in order to make this work. Somebody else said this was what we could agree on to make this work. Very different approaches to understanding that this is what we could. But what do they mean to you? It's not that they're a sacred text that you read it and you have to go and do what they mean. They're principles. They're not rules. They're principles that we live by. And that is the question today. Do we live by them? And particularly, what do we think about the 5th principle? That we will work for a democratic process in our society at large. What does that mean to us? I think what it meant to the Unitarians and to the Universalists in the beginning of our country was that the Declaration of Independence was the promise and the Constitution was the fulfillment of that promise. And I think that's what it meant to them, carrying out the democratic process. And to begin with thinking through that, I was listening to Marianne Williamson. I don't know if you looked at that on the Facebook page, and we have a pretty active Facebook page these days, like for the church and our blog. And she said something very interesting. She kind of updated the frame of our nation when looking at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. She said that frame that we built, we created a space where we could self-actualize. Now, I would not have put the word self-actualize with the Declaration and Constitution, but however, she was onto something. That we created a frame as a nation, the beginning of our nation. What we did was we created a space that we could self-actualize, that we could work toward freedom for all of people, including women, including minorities, and those words are in there, the seeds are in there, although they weren't actualized when it first came about. So in a sense, we created the boundaries of a homeland. This is what we did. This was our homeland. And I got to thinking, well, can we go back and can we have some understanding of what home means for us, and then generalize that out? What would that look like as a nation? And I think a home has a sense of safety, a sense of belonging. In our homes, looking at the earth spirituality, the 3 core values in earth spirituality in our home, we have a right to exist. We have the right to the habitat of the home. I'm thinking of an infant or a child and the adult and extended family of that community experiencing that child as that child is growing, that they nurture and love and try to help that child flourish for who they are, and the right to flourish. Good principles for a home. The right to be, we have the right to exist in a home. We sense that, the right to habitat, the right to what we need to nurture us, and the right to flourish. Oliver Wendell Holmes, where we love is home. Where we love is home. So it's not passive. Active. Where we love is home. Home that our feet may leave, but not our hearts. Home is where the heart is. There is nothing like staying at home for real comfort. when you're driving home and you open that front door, do you feel, then that's your home. Home is where you hang the hat. Do you remember Smedley Butler? I don't know if you remember that name, Smedley Butler, General in the United States Army, Colonel in the United States Army. He's the one that wrote that I was a thug for the corporations, and if you remember that, and he was the one that was approached to overthrow President Roosevelt and testified before Congress. That fella and turned them in, even though Congress said yes. General Smedley Butler, you are correct. There was an act of overthrowing our government, but they didn't act on it. But he did interrupt that process. He has this to say about home. General Smedley Butler, who stopped the overthrow of our nation in, I think it was 1933 or 34. He says this about home. There are only two things we should fight for, the general says. One is the defense of our homes, and the other is the Bill of Rights. The other is the Bill of Rights. A couple readings from Thomas Jefferson. And the basic difference between the two parties. Men, by their constitutions, are naturally divided into two parties. Those who fear and distrust the people and wish to draw all powers from them into the hand of the higher classes. 2, those who identify themselves with the people, have confidence in them, cherish and consider them as the most honest and safe, although not the most wise depository of public interest. Quite sure how to interpret that, but he's saying we do need leadership. Another quote. Warring against the principles of the people, there is no length to which the delusion of the people may not be pushed by a party in possession of the revenues and the legal authorities of the United States for a short time indeed, but yet long enough to admit much particular mischief. Those in power would push the delusion of the people to manipulate the people. There is no event, he continues, there is no event, therefore, however atrocious, which may not be expected. 1798, Thomas Jefferson. And one that may be an affirmation of the Unitarians, or it may be a warning to the Unitarians. Speaking of the founding of the University of Virginia, Jefferson's curriculum for the university was no less an achievement in the history of American education. He planned for courses in modern as well as ancient languages, in pure mathematics, military, naval, architecture, mechanics, optics, astronomy, geography, anatomy, physical chemistry, and natural history, law, and fine arts, still deeply suspicious of any religious sect, save those of Quakers and Unitarians. I'm not sure if that's a warning or affirmation. I'm going to take it as both. He admitted religious instruction except in the branch of ethics. He said, priests dread the advance of science as witches do the approach of daylight. I think in modern day terms we have to say, wait a minute, you can't disparage the witches. Let's pull that out. Right? Priests dread the advance of science. Recently, the governor of Wyoming, there's a new national federal science program that they move out and want to get into the high schools and want to get into the school system. And this year they want to include climate change and that human beings are affecting climate change, right? So the governor of Wyoming has voted against that coming into Wyoming. So I'm wondering, he is a priest of what? Priest fear science. He is a priest of what? Again, it has been said that the Declaration of Independence was the promise, and the Constitution was its fulfillment. And understanding anything, we have to understand things in historical perspective. And one thing I know about rights, when we talk about inalienable rights, but if we're declaring we have rights, the implication is we've been intruded upon. I don't know I need rights until my rights have been violated. Does that make any sense? I'm not conscious that I need protection. I'm not conscious that I need space in order to self-actualize unless that space has been intruded upon, unless that space has been withdrawn from me, where Robert Frost said, until the harness is loose, freedom. I'm thinking until the harness is, right? Well, when that harness gets tighter and tighter and tighter, then I know it needs to be loosened, and I have a right for it to be loosened, right? So, okay, so to understand rights is to understand rights are a push back. So rights aren't an illusion, they are a defense. Rights are a defense. And this is a quote from William Kreml. You might remember him. We brought him in several years ago to speak to us about constitutional rights and the Constitution, professor from South Carolina. He says that the first tier of political theory within modern Western thought is most commonly called classical liberalism. He said over a period of its development, which is several hundred years, the works of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and the early work of John Stuart Mill and many others delineated personal liberties that protect citizens from unjust governments or the whims of monarchs or aristocracies or even the established church. Over time, liberalism also ensured that citizens were entitled to participate in governmental decisions. This is new in human history. That citizens would be able to participate in governmental decisions. Do we have a right to participate in governmental decisions? And if we do, ought we to defend that right if it becomes threatened? Writers such as Thomas Paine, Samuel Adams, and political actors including Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson were important figures during the development of the new United States. To participate. The 14th Amendment after the Civil War was an amendment that bestowed rights on free slaves.
13.
Well, 13, 14, and 15 had to deal with that. Right. Yeah. Thanks, Mom.
Sorry.
No, you're right. 13, 14, and 15. The 14th. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law that shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of liberty or property without due process of law, or deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. All persons born or naturalized. It does not say incorporated. It says born or naturalized, right? So right after this amendment, 1868, a few of the Supreme Court decisions right after that. So my guess is those are the Supreme Court justices who understood the intent and meaning of that amendment since it was 2 or 3 years later. They made these decisions in these cases. Paul versus Virginia, in the conclusion, a corporation is not a citizen. Just flat out, a corporation is not a citizen. And that was a year later in 1869. In 1873, they were talking about corporations having protections. Corporations were not included in the protections of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. These amendments do not apply to corporations, Supreme Court decision. 1877, the 14th Amendment cannot be used to protect corporations from state law. Because if you remember, at that point, the state had the power over the corporation, not the federal government. Okay. Between 1890 and 1910, between those 20 years, 19 Supreme Court cases dealt with the African American, 288 dealt with corporations trying to get personhood. Just a barrage going into the Supreme Court. That means the cases went from local court to regional court to Supreme Court, right? That means they've had the money and the funds to move these cases all up along the way. Okay. The purpose of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The introduction to the foundation of the promise of the Declaration of Independence. So the structure that was developed at that point was this. You have the Declaration of Independence, the promise. You have the Constitution, the structure to fulfill that promise. Let's say on this side of the Constitution, you have the establishment of Congress. One of the responsibilities of Congress, among others, one of the responsibilities of Congress is to regulate commerce, interstate commerce. Anything that has to do with interstate commerce comes under the regulation of Congress. Okay? Corporations are privileged. They get privileges to operate from Congress to enact whatever they're going to do. Okay? Over on that side. Over on this side, you have the Constitution, which says the citizens have rights, the Bill of Rights, not to be oppressed by the federal government. At first, that mostly applied to states. After the Civil War, it began to apply to individuals. So here you have the Constitution that says the Congress functions like this over here. Part of that responsibility is to regulate commerce. Part of that responsibility is to understand the function of corporations. That's over here. Corporations are acts of commerce. Over here, you have the Bill of Rights protecting citizens against an oppressive federal government. And in our history, the reason for the Declaration of Independence was the relationship between England and the East Indian Tea Company. It wasn't just England. It wasn't England's tea that was thrown into the Boston Bay. It was a corporation's tea that was thrown in the Boston Bay. It was business's tea. So they understood the oppression of corporations, and they understood that they needed this Bill of Rights to protect them from the federal government. Here's what happened. This act of commerce to incorporate corporate personhood, corporations manipulated the judicial process. Now, corporations, an act of commerce, have moved from the regulation of commerce. They have moved because of corporate personhood. They have moved over here. They stand alongside citizens. They have the Bill of Rights to protect them against the federal government. They have the Bill of Rights to protect them against the regulation of Congress. We no longer have the fulfillment of the promise of the Declaration of Independence. We no longer have a Constitution that fulfills that promise. That's done. We don't have that. For example, in 1978, OSHA, these agencies, OSHA, the EPA, these are agencies of the Congress. They are empowered to do congressional work. They are empowered to deal with the privileges that they grant corporations. So in 1978, OSHA goes onto the OSHA goes into this corporation territory to check for safety violations. They just show up. They just come in because they are the Congress that gives the privileges. They just come in. In a sense, it is their right to do that. The corporation says, no, under the Fourth Amendment, you have to get a warrant in order to do that. How many of you watch detective shows? You're mostly have a TV and are an American. We watch detective. British got some good detective shows as well. One thing I've noticed in these detective shows, often when somebody goes get a warrant, somebody in that police station calls the people and warns them that the warrant's coming. You've seen that scenario? That's there. Okay? So by the time OSHA has to go to court and get a warrant, the company's going to know what's happening. That's why we have people expecting safety regulations. And that's why we have them just walking in. One time an airplane was flying over and saw this toxic thing going on, and the corporation said, no, you didn't have probable cause to look at our property. Therefore, what you found, you could not, and since we're citizens, we're protected from that. In 1933 in Florida, J.C. Penney said we want to put a chain store in Florida. And Florida has this balance in its community, in their state, and in their commerce. And Florida said, well, if you do that, that's unfair competition because you have this big chain and you can get things cheaper enough. And if you just come in here, you will put our Florida citizens out of business. 1933, that was pretty clear. J.C. Penney said, oh, no, you can't do that because we're a citizen, that's unfair. And you don't have a right to charge us more taxes to come into this state to put this big box store here, which is designed for the purpose of sucking money out of the community and taking it somewhere else. I mean, that's what that does, right? The Supreme Court ruled in favor of J.C. Penney. They came in and put people out of business. We know what Bass Pro Shop, the 3 stores they just put in up and down 95. We know that interferes with the business of the local people and local bake shops and so forth. It just does. So what we have now is a new model of governance. We don't have Congress regulating and Citizens United and the money going into business. All that's involved here. We don't have a Congress that can regulate corporations. Because now the corporations have protections against congressional regulation. So the new governance is this, that we stand alongside corporations behind the Bill of Rights, and we've got to engage corporations, and corporations engaging us. And we don't have congressional government protection against East India Company. We don't have that any longer. It's no longer the same Constitution. There's no way, with the structure of the Constitution and the law today, that we can have a fulfillment of the promise of the Declaration of Independence. It's not possible. As the law stands today. There is not a Supreme Court justice on the bench today. And there have been Supreme Court justices, as I read, that knew the intent of the 14th Amendment. There's not a Supreme Court justice on the bench today, liberal, conservative, that does not support corporate personhood. Every one of them supports corporate personhood. And that hasn't been true until the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. There has always been a few Supreme Court justices that said, no, the 14th Amendment was never designed to protect corporations. It was only designed to protect people, particularly African American free slaves. Not one Supreme Court justice today stands against that decision. They all are in favor of it. And the so-called liberals would say, well, Congress has to regulate corporations, right? So Congress does regulate corporations, campaign finance laws and other such things, right? They regulate Congress. But then when it gets to the Supreme Court, depending on the balance of the nature, the legislative process of Congress, our representatives, is usurped if it's a 5-4 vote. So Congress is rendered powerless to regulate corporations. As people who once a week say we are committed to the democratic process of our society at large, we are committed to the democratic process. How do we respond to this? What do we do? What do we do? How do we respond? And there are certain moves to amend. There are a lot of processes out there. Marianne Williamson, once again, quoted her, a very inspirational talk. She said something I hadn't heard anybody else say. It's something I have been thinking. What if a constitutional amendment comes around? That corporations are not persons, and that money is not free speech. Just think about that statement. The Supreme Court said money is equal to free speech. There's an insanity going on. Of course, money is not equal to free speech, but our law says it is. Therefore, ultimately, corporation. You know, a corporation in California can send money to the local sheriff's office here, for the election of the sheriff. Why would they do that? So somebody in California can a city commissioner can well, you know, why would he be interested? What's going on with that? When, if that constitutional amendment ever comes around, we have to have 38 state legislatures to pass that. So what is our job between now and the 10 years? If that, this probably takes 10 years for that to come around. What is our obligation in the next 10 years? To have moved to amend meetings or whatever? No. Our obligation is to organize our community so that it represents our voice in all forms of government. That's our obligation. If we are to take that fifth principle seriously. If we are going to move, because we are losing the democratic process. The Constitution is no longer the tool to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence. It's just not. And it's hard. In nature, it takes a tree, I think it's like 100 years. If nature starts changing, it takes a tree 100 years to grow if the climate starts changing. It takes 100 years. And that's why people are concerned about climate change, because if climate change within 10 years, the trees don't have time to adjust. Like they don't have that time to move. Well, the human being's imagination is similar. It's hard for us to change symbols in the way we understand. How many of you, raise your hand, how many of you have ever been into therapy and worked on changing a particular behavior pattern, worked on changing a particular belief? How long does it take? 6 months, a year, 2 years to really deeply change it? It doesn't happen overnight. So even though I realize that the Constitution is no longer the instrument to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence, in order for my psyche to really understand the full meaning of that, it may take me 10 years, it may take me 5 years to really understand the full meaning of that. Because that's how the imagination works. It doesn't work. It took me 30 or 20 years to fully understand that I wasn't going to change the Southern Baptist Convention to match me. After all, I had the truth, and I read the Bible better than they, right? And so I stayed there everywhere I went, trying to change that. Original sin's not in the Bible. Look at it. We're created good. God created and everything, called it very good. Right? So, no, it didn't matter. I could stay there the rest of my life. Actually, I couldn't, but you know, it takes a while for the imagination and for the way our affect and our emotions are invested in our way of life to change. It doesn't happen overnight. And this is a call in our nation now. We are at a time in history when there are serious changes going on. We are in it. We're in the middle of it. We don't have time to wait 20 years and reflect to see the meaning of it. Because it'll be too late. It'll be too late. So what do? We do what we've been doing. And we just keep doing more of it. We do last year with the conference, this year with the conference, we bring David Cobb in. Eric goes down to Space Coast Progressive Alliance, raises up, raises his fist in the face of power and says, this is not right. You know, look at that. We continue to do what we're doing because what we're doing is good and it is right. And we've been doing it. As far as churches go, maybe we're not alone, but sometimes I feel that way. But the community is here. So we just keep doing what we're doing, we keep plugging at it. And the more we look at it, the more we get into it, the more real it is, the more serious it is when we look at it. $2 billion spent on a presidential election? That's not from citizens. We don't have billions of dollars. So and keep doing what we're doing. And I want to say thank you for supporting a church that deals with these issues.